Hello, David. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Will. I'm very excited to be here.
Now, let's just dive in. You're a current student at Harvard Business School. You've just finished your first semester, and you came into this program after working for over, I believe, half a decade at a startup as the first employee. Now, before we get into all of those, I want our audience to learn a little bit more about your experience so far here at Harvard Business School. Has the experience so far been what you've expected of HBS?
I think largely speaking, yes, as much as you can sort of anticipate what that's going to be like. And for me, that's just because I was quite ambivalent about whether I wanted to do business school. And even once I decided to do B school, which one to go to. And as a result, I did a lot of due diligence. And I think I came in, relatively speaking, with pretty open eyes about what to expect. And that has, for the most part, held true, I'd say, at least in broad strokes. I think the experience has been a whirlwind, as you know. It's crazy busy. There's a million things to do at any given second of any given day, and you're constantly juggling trade-offs and priorities. But it's been a lot of fun. I feel like I've learned a lot. I've met a lot of really interesting people, and it's been a nice experience so far.
Has the experience been similar to your expectations initially? Before you came, of course, to the school itself, many of us have, looked at various business schools. Of course, Harvard Business School is well known for its reputation as one of the best business school programs in the country. Was the experience what you expected going into it?
In broad strokes, yes. And I think the area where, just from my observations, where I most see the HBS experience deviating from expectations is on how rigorous the academics are and just how much time that takes and how seriously they're taken here. I think a lot of my friends here, frankly, were not expecting that. They were expecting a different sort of business school experience where it's more of sort of a party for 2 years. And for me, again, I did the due diligence. I did a ton of informational phone calls when I was trying to make this decision. And ultimately, this was one of the reasons I chose HBS, was because that component of the academic rigor really appealed to me. And so because I had, put in the time and done those calls, it wasn't a huge surprise to me in the way that I think for a lot of people, at least this first semester can be a little bit different than what they were expecting.
Absolutely. Wanted to also dive in for our audience. HBS is a big school. There's over 900, I believe 940 to 950 students overall in each year of the program itself. But Harvard also divides the overall class into something called sections. About 10 sections overall exist, about 90 or so, 95 or so students are in each section. Can you tell us a little bit about your section and the section experience? What do you feel about this experience is so quintessential to, of course, the 2-year program at Harvard?
Yeah, so I'm in Section C, which is an amazing section.
Shout out
to Section C, yeah. And I think, as you know, the section experience really is the crux of, at least for the first semester, but from what I've heard, really the entire first year and on. It's really the crux of your social experience at HBS. It's the crux, certainly, of your academic experience. And it is sort of the extended family that you build once you get to Harvard. It's 94 people or whatever the number is that you take all of your classes with, you go on retreats with, you have social events with, and it's how you sort of learn the lay of the land here at HBS. And it's been an amazing experience. Like you said, it's a big school, especially relative to other business schools. And so it's nice having a more digestible chunk of people that you can really relate to and get to know. And also, frankly, I think it forces people to interact who might not otherwise, cross paths just because maybe their hobbies are different or just the places that they would naturally, assemble after class might be different, or the classes they would take might be different. And so it's a way to sort of force you to get an interesting cross-section of the HBS school and learn from them. And it's just been an incredibly rewarding experience. I love my section. We've got some amazing people there. And it's just been a real privilege to be a part of it.
Absolutely. Now, you also mentioned briefly in there, right, this section process is a core part of the academic experience because you are as a part of the first year at HBS, you're in the same classes every single day with this group of people. Another really core component, of course, that is unique to the Harvard Business School education within the academic frame is Harvard Business School cases. And students, for those that don't know, must prepare a case for pretty much every single class, all type, whether the class is to do with finance or to do with leadership, marketing, as we've learned this semester so far. Um, how have you enjoyed, or how have you perceived the case methodology to be for your educational academic experience so far?
I think broadly speaking, it's been a great experience and a great way to learn. And I think the reason is rather than learning in a sort of detached academic way, it really puts you as close to the practitioner piece of business as you can be while still being, of course, in a classroom at a university. And so it forces you to really take in a bunch of data, synthesize it, come to a perspective, and then argue it in the midst of strongly held conflicting opinions in class. And I think that is a really good muscle to develop, and this case methodology really forces you to. I think critics of the case methodology would probably argue that, at least in certain instances, it makes more sense to at least learn some of the fundamentals outside of the case methodology, and I think that's probably true. It's not really a one size fits all approach, but I think at a high level, I feel like the case methodology has really served me well so far, and is the closest you can get in a classroom setting to really replicating what it's like in a high stakes meeting, in a business.
Certainly. I think there's been some critiques of college education, certainly, perhaps at some level graduate school education, because it has largely been very similar across the decades. And to see a lot of these common criticisms of do we need college now? Do we need graduate school when you could be working in the real world? As some of the critiques of kind of this more insulated educational method may be. Do you think those kind of critiques, do you think the consistency of the educational model, perhaps here at HBS or other business schools even, do you think that's the fact that it's consistent is both good, but do you think there are some validities to perhaps some of these criticisms, or the model itself towards actually producing high quality leaders in the real world?
Yeah, I mean, I think most ways of there's so many different sorts of things you need to learn, not just to be successful in a business capacity, but in any, you name the subject. And I think probably it would just be an awfully big coincidence if every single one of those different tools and techniques was best taught and instructed in the exact same method, which is to say, I don't think it's one size fits all. I think probably a slightly more targeted toolkit would be more advantageous.
Mhm.
That said, I think you have something at HBS that's very special, and it is something that probably gets it right, 80-90% of the time. So I'm quite happy with the product in terms of the classroom experience. But yeah, I think on the margins there's probably room for tweaking here and there.
Yeah. Well, speaking of various educations, I would love for our audience to learn a little bit more about your background as well before HBS, right? Beyond Harvard, what made David David? Can you tell us a little bit about your college experience? And I believe you went to Stanford. You graduated in 2016, and then after that, of course, you worked for about 6-7 years, I believe, right? As well.
Yeah, so you're right. I went to Stanford. I majored in political science. Didn't really know what I wanted to do when I was in college, and wound up coming across political science as sort of, it felt at the time like a compromise between the stuff I was really interested in, the humanities, philosophy, history, that sort of thing, and the stuff that I felt was more marketable, i.e. more quantitative, like economics or statistics or something like that. Poli-sci felt like the happy middle ground. And what wound up happening in college is I started learning more about. I always cared about sort of the social impact of the work I wanted to do. And a big blind spot that I had coming into college was really the food system and just how great a potential for impact there is if we can build a food system that works better for everybody. And so specifically, I grew up with a wiener dog named Leo, a miniature dachshund. He was adorable, and I think like many people in the world, he was a family member, and
Right.
I would have done anything to prevent him from feeling pain or suffering. Um, and essentially, what happened in college is I started learning about just the way animals are treated in our livestock system in the U.S. and also globally. And it just at a certain point, I realized that it felt inconsistent to care so much about pampering my dog, who I loved, and making sure he lived the most happy, spoiled existence ever, which I think a lot of people can relate to. But at the same time, being okay and supporting an industry that was doing things to animals that would probably make your listeners sick.
What specific industries are you talking about? Like the food supply, as you mentioned, or other instances as well?
It's not just the food industry. Certainly, this exists in entertainment. It exists in cosmetic device testing and fashion. I think the thing that's unique about the food industry is just the scale of the impact.
Right.
So in 1 year, more animals will be slaughtered for food than the number of humans that have ever existed on the planet Earth, which is just like a mind-boggling thing to even comprehend. Like we can't even comprehend how big that number is. And 90+% of those animals are raised in horrific conditions that, if you were doing that to a dog or a cat, you could be tried for an animal cruelty felony in the US.
Right.
And so there's just this fundamental contradiction, I think, between the way we treat our dogs and cats and the way we treat, chickens and pigs and fish and cows. And that really got me thinking. It got me reading some philosophy. Peter Singer is a philosopher out of Princeton who wrote a book called Animal Liberation, which I felt made a very compelling sort of logical argument about, the moral value of animals. And just really got me to come to the conclusion that from a ESG perspective, if we're talking about business specifically, but also just from a broad social impact perspective, this was a really neglected issue, and two, an issue where the scale of impact that an individual can have is just massive because of how big the problem is and how few people at the time were working on it. And I also at that time did some work with a nonprofit called Mercy for Animals, which is doing some amazing work trying to get corporations and public policies to treat animals better, trying to get people to change their eating patterns, reduce their meat consumption, that sort of thing. And they're one of the leading nonprofits in the space, and that sort of also helped introduce me to this world. And then at that point, I learned about this emerging field of food technology. And at that time, there was no Impossible Burger. There was no Beyond Burger. It was the very, very early stages of that industry,
Right.
or at least sort of the recent rejuvenation that industry has seen. But I learned about it through the context of a company that was making mayonnaise from plants. Interned there over the summer, got really interested in, okay, what if instead of trying to get billions of people to change their eating habits, what if instead of trying to pass laws in these countries that are largely beholden to the agribusiness industry, what if instead we just changed the way these products were made so that they didn't require animals? And I learned through sort of the nonprofit grapevine. I mentioned Mercy for Animals as a group I was involved with. But I learned through some of those nonprofit grapevines about, at the time, a company called Memphis Meats. It's now called Upside Foods. And they were the only company at that time. They had just been founded. They had not had any press or anything. They were pretty heads down in research and development. And they were the only company that was working on cultivated meat, that is meat grown from animal cells without raising animals. And so I reached out to Uma Valetti, the CEO. He's a cardiologist from the Mayo Clinic. It seemed like a good fit, so they brought me on. And as you said, I worked with them for 7.5 years as their first employee, from December 2015 through I left in August to come to HBS, August 2023. So it was a wild ride.
Yeah, that's so interesting how your journey from being a political science major at Stanford to then working for 7 or so years for startup, which I don't think is necessarily unusual for a Stanford, from understanding Stanford graduates, but specifically so deeply into this field of creating alternative meats. Um, I think for our audience, I'm just a little bit curious before we get there, before we dive a little bit deeper into that part. If your passion before you went to college itself, were you always interested in kind of like this topic, this kind of pursuit, or did you have different potentially goals or aspirations before you even went to Stanford?
Not at all. I was definitely not coming in thinking about this as a viable career path. I mean, obviously, I knew that I loved animals, but that is hardly unique to me. I think, that's probably a majority of people, certainly in the US and also across the world. Like I said, they care about animals as family members, and, helping their dog, making their dog feel better is like one of the best things that, they can do from just how it makes them feel. And I ate a lot of meat, and I loved it. I mean, I grew up eating a ton of meat, ton of dairy, eggs, all that stuff. It was a big part of my identity. So this really didn't cross my mind. It was more just watching videos of factory farming, reading the Peter Singer book, working for Mercy for Animals that really got me interested in this as a subject area. What I was interested coming in to Stanford to potentially do as like exploring was more in the traditional political science route of like working for a campaign or running for office or something like that. And I think honestly, I think the reason I was interested in that at that time was because I had been watching The West Wing, the reruns, and that is such a romanticization of what it's like to be in political office.
Certainly.
A few years later, House of Cards came out, and
Right.
I watched that, and that sort of turned me off of it.
Ah.
But that was sort of what I came in with the inkling to sort of explore, and I did a little bit of that in college, but then I learned about this other area, and it just felt like I could have a bigger impact by focusing on that.
Got it. And it certainly seems like this is a space that is certainly growing very fast and certainly very needed. So let's dive a little bit more into it. You were 7+ years at this startup. Tell us a little bit about being the first employee officially, creating a company from scratch in a nascent industry itself.
Yeah, and I think that last part is key because not only was everything we were doing, not only were we building a company from scratch, but we really were building an industry from scratch. You fast forward today, there's over 150 cultivated meat companies globally. But again, at the time I joined Memphis Meats, now Upside Foods, that was the only one. There were no other companies across the world. And what that meant is incredible opportunities to explore, to sort of pioneer this space, and to take on leadership roles, both internally within the company, but also externally. Like one of the things I did was I was the vice president of our trade association, which I helped found of the industry. I think the flip side of that is you're just dealing with a lot of ambiguity because there is no role scoped out. There's not a job description.
Right.
You are sort of doing a little bit of everything, and you're constantly negotiating with yourself and with others, sort of, what needs to be done, what are some, areas, white spaces that need to be done. And also, there's a million things that need to be done. What are the things so important that you need to prioritize them above everything else? So it's a challenge. It's exhilarating and super fun. But it's also a very hard challenge to solve. And I think everybody who's an early employee at a company, and especially if it's the first company in the field, would probably say something similar.
Run us through what a typical day might be like for you, perhaps in the first few years when you were at the job.
Oh man, I mean, there is no typical day, is the honest truth. It so changes depending on what the company goals are. So for instance, if we're raising a funding round, it might be helping Uma, our CEO, on that front, helping research potential investors, prepare for meetings, that sort of thing. I did a lot of work on the PR side. So, reaching out to journalists, public education to get them, interested in what this was so that they could, communicate to their readers their take on the space. And also government relations was a huge part of my role, because back in 2015 there wasn't really a regulatory pathway to market for these products. That's changed today. Upside was the first company in the cultivated meat space to get FDA clearance in last November, I think it was. And then in June, they followed up with USDA clearance and then sold our first product in this past July. But there was just a lot of different tracks that needed to succeed in order for the company and the industries to succeed, and it was doing a little bit of everything. So I'd say to slightly better answer your question, although it's not going to be totally satisfying, it changes every day. It is a constant mix of, okay, what are the proactive things that I'm going to come in the morning and say I need to get XYZ done, but then also being adaptable and flexible. And when something comes out of left field and you need to deal with it, if it's important enough, being willing to drop everything and deal with it. That is sort of the name of the game for early stage startups.
I think definitely our viewers who are interested in pursuing that kind of entrepreneurial path will definitely appreciate your insights on that. Well, tell us about the success of the company Upside Foods in the last 7-8 years since it's been founded. And before, of course, you left to come to HBS. The industry, like you said, has grown tremendously. And I believe maybe if I think for the first time or like very recently, HBS actually taught a case as well about kind of this new industry, about a company specific that dealt with cultivated meats, I believe. How has the company been doing in the 7 years?
Yeah, the answer is very well. So Upset, as I mentioned, was the first company in the cultivated meat space. And it has really, obviously I have bias since I worked there for 7.5 years, but it has really accomplished milestone after milestone for the industry. So, it depends sort of what dimension you're talking about, but there's a few key ones. One is on the investment side. It's raised over $600 million. It's brought in investors ranging from impact investors like Bill Gates and Richard Branson and Kimball Musk to massive meat companies like Tyson Foods and Cargill, John Mackey, the co-CEO of Whole Foods. And so it has really done a good job of building this Big Ten philosophy, this notion that lots of different types of stakeholders are going to be interested in this as a potential fix for the food system.
Absolutely.
And so it's going to take all of those folks to sort of get this across the finish line. So that was one, I think, really precedent-setting thing. And what we've seen is that after Upside announced those investors, other companies followed and bringing on other meat companies or other major impact investors. And so there's really been this proliferation. I think the regulatory process, as I mentioned, was absolutely key. Upside was the first company to get FDA approval, and then we got USDA approval this past June. And then I think, most importantly, in July, we became the first company to sell cultivated meat in the U.S. In a restaurant in San Francisco called Bar Cran. And that was just incredibly rewarding to be there from day one to this incredible closing of a big chapter of the pre-revenue phase.
So for our audience who might not be entirely clear within this broader industry, what is the difference between cultivated meats versus alternative meats and, the Impossible Burger, right? These other companies that also exist in similar spaces.
Yeah, and that's a great question because there's so much misinformation and confusion out there about this. So I'm glad you asked. So there's sort of three categories of what is sometimes referred to as alternative protein. And the first is plant-based, which I think most folks will be familiar with. And that is, how can we take plants, whether it's soy or pea protein or oat or whatever, and restructure them in a way that tastes similar and has a similar nutrient profile and functionality to conventionally produced meat. So that's like Impossible Burger, Beyond Meat, those sorts of ones. There's cultivated meat, which is what Upside is doing and what the other 150 companies that have proliferated in the space are doing. And that is taking animal cells and growing them outside of the animal's body. And so the idea here is you can basically recreate the conditions that naturally exist inside an animal, but you do it without the animal. And you just put some of the animal's cells in there, and then you can grow and culture what is an actual piece of meat. So this is not a vegan or vegetarian product. It is real meat. It's just produced without the animals.
For audiences that maybe, of course, this is so very new, right? It's hard to imagine. So you don't see it. You see the animals, right? You know where your meat come from. So I think there's some, perhaps for audiences who are very much into like, we want meat. And there's definitely a core segment of the United States, of the market, that certainly are very hesitant, let's say at the very least, about these alternative meats, or like you said, Impossible Burger, that are, they view it as hyper processed and not necessarily as healthy. You're saying cultivated meats is basically cultivating the meat, the cells themselves, without necessarily, obviously, having to maintain a sentient or a living animal, right? And so that's where both the ethical, you view ethical positives of both serving the needs of people who want to eat meat, but also without necessarily the animal component itself, and that's where kind of the value lies in this space.
I think that's it. I think there's other value propositions as well, though. So from a climate change perspective, livestock production is responsible for, it depends on what study you look at, somewhere between 15 and 18% of greenhouse gas emissions. So it's a huge challenge, and it's something that we need to address if we're going to meet these Paris Climate Accord agreements. From a public health perspective, a vast majority of antibiotics in the U.S. are used for livestock. Exactly. And it creates these major risks for bacterial pandemics. So we just obviously went through a viral pandemic with COVID, but there's also the risk of a bacterial pandemic where basically the bacteria have been exposed to the antibiotics so frequently that they start to evolve to be resistant to them.
Right.
And you could be looking at this like horrific dystopian world where the antibiotics we take for granted today, like penicillin, just don't work because the bacteria have evolved beyond them. So that's a huge risk. And then I think another one, which is also, critically important, is you look at just the math of how many resources it takes to produce meat today and what global population trends are doing. Demand for meat is skyrocketing.
Yeah.
Resources are not skyrocketing. In fact, they're dwindling.
Right.
And there's just not enough resources on the planet to meet future demand for meat. If demand for meat is going to double, say, and it currently uses a third of the world's arable land.
Wow.
How are we going to get that extra third of land to produce the meat? The answer is we need to come up with new ways of producing the same products that consumers love.
Right. I think there was a study out there, not going to know specifically which one, but it takes like a significant amount of agricultural produce to like 100 grams of agricultural produce were needed to grow 1 gram of meat or something in that proportion. You're saying that cultivated meats has the potential of being less resource intensive to basically cultivate the same amount of meat.
Yeah, exactly. At scale, the goal of the industry is to be substantially more resource efficient than conventionally produced meat. Now, it'll take some scale to get there.
Yeah.
The companies are largely operating at reasonably small scales right now. But that is sort of the North Star that's guiding the entire industry. And that's also a reason why, that's an environmental benefit. It's also a business and economic benefit as well.
Certainly. It's clear that this is a big issue. You spent, most of your professional life tackling that right now. I wanted to bring us back to, it seems like you've had great success, and this company is, before you left for HBS, is going to market finally and really growing this space with a lot of potential. Why did you feel, back in 2022 perhaps, that you wanted to leave that behind and go to business school, to not essentially work full time for 2 years?
Yeah, well, I will say it was not an easy decision, and I agonized over it for quite a bit. Business school had always been something I was considering, and the reason I applied the year I did apply, honestly was because my standardized test scores were going to expire. So I knew it was my last shot because I didn't want to retake that test. But even throughout the application process and after I was accepted, I was not at all sure that it made sense for me. I think there were a few things that ultimately got me to be here today, and I'm glad that I am. One, I felt that there was a sense in which going to business school would allow me to explore from a functional perspective, what I was most interested in.
Yeah.
I'm somebody who knows exactly what industry I want to be in. I want to stay in the alternative protein space and really devote my professional career to getting animals out of the food system. But I wasn't totally sure in what capacity I wanted to do that, and this would provide me some chance for exploration. Two, it would provide me a chance to understand business in a more formal and holistic way. When you're working at a startup, and especially when you're working at a startup that is pre-revenue for most of its existence, when I was there, we started bringing in some modest amounts of revenue near the end when we sold our first product. You get incredible exposure to a very specific set of problems. And it was amazing, and I wouldn't trade a single second of my time at Upside Foods. But I also recognize if I wanted to understand what it's like to be at, for instance, a big mature company that's bringing in millions or billions of dollars of revenue each year, it would make more sense to try and do that via business school. So those were some of the main things. I also think that at least in certain industries, the credential is valuable. I think it's a little hard to predict where the future is going in that respect. I think society tends to be drifting away from the more old-fashioned view of an MBA as sort of a gating credential, but it's not totally out of fashion. And so I think that's, it felt like it could be helpful.
That makes sense. And there's certainly, we're all here in this school system now, and I definitely recognize your kind of insights. Similarly, I think, like you said, overall, there's been a decrease in the number of MBAs, applicants overall in the U.S., especially for even the best of business schools, and so the value proposition ultimately is, often the question from those who apply and also those who don't have the degree and those 2 years that they could be working, how useful is that MBA is definitely a question that remains. Even probably even the question even grows even stronger as time will go on. Let's dive into what you hope ultimately to take away at the end of 2 years when you graduate in May of 2025, which seems like a long time away, but even this semester, a quarter of our time here is finished, and it, in my experience, it seems to have passed quite quickly. In a year and a half from now, what do you view as your next steps beyond Harvard Business School?
Yeah, I guess the thing for me, one of the things that is most interesting to me about being here is truly the learnings about different business models and different functions within a business.
Yeah.
And so when I graduate, I hope to have a more holistic sense of what the different pieces that make a business tick are and how they fit together and what that sort of looks like from a strategic perspective. I want to stay in the alternative protein industry. There's a number of different ways that could look post MBA. So I'm still like most people here. I don't have it all figured out yet, but I'm excited to sort of explore over the next year and a half. And I totally agree with you that it does feel like it's gone incredibly fast so far.
Yeah. Well, let's dive into a little bit about life beyond HBS. There are many different things you could do, specifically in this alternative protein space. Do you see yourself focused on joining something that has already been established? Do you see yourself potentially starting an endeavor yourself, potentially, at some point? Like, where do you feel you would derive the most passion and energy from in kind of tackling the problems and the opportunities that this space provides?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm unlikely to start my own thing. in part because I feel like I got a front row seat to that at Upside, and I know what it's like, and it's a very intense job. It's long hours, it's a lot of risk, it's a lot of stress, and so I think only very specific types of people are really well suited to found their own company, especially if it's in a space that is so complicated and cross-functional as the alternative protein industry is. I am interested. I think the first major decision point for me will be big or small company, and that's something where this summer I'm going to be working at a big food company that has some alternative protein brands. I'm very excited to experience that because I've only ever known what it's like to be at a early stage startup, and I think there's a lot of value in understanding these larger companies as well. And then I think depending on how the summer goes, I'll have a decision to make post MBA as to whether I want to stay at a big company or return to the startup world. But honestly, I couldn't say for sure at this point.
Makes sense. And we have never know what the future holds. Certainly I think graduates in 2007, 2008 experienced some challenges that even whatever summer internship experience they may have had. Let's dive into a little bit about your thoughts on this space, which of course you've spent so much of your time on, that clearly you're deeply passionate about alternative proteins. You mentioned earlier that Upside Foods has not been a Big Ten company. It has not only been focused on getting VC funding, but it has gone stakeholders and from the meats, the industry itself, right? Industrialized companies like Tyson, as you mentioned, Cargill, which for those that don't know are hugely influential corporations, public and private, that essentially has so much responsibility over the supply chain, food supply chain in the United States and perhaps even globally in some areas, in some markets. The success of Upside Food has been, it has brought on these stakeholders that maybe others would view as disruptors. Like we'll take Uber, for example. It would have been quite strange if Uber had taken funding perhaps from some cab companies or cab associations, like, we want you as a stakeholder, which it certainly was the disruptor of that industry at a time. But Upside Food brought existing industry leaders in to do it. How do you view kind of the impact that has for building out this alternative protein industry, and would it achieve the goals, and would it achieve the goals that are aligned with the values that ultimately was this aspirational goal?
Yeah, I think so. I think there's a tremendous role for the established food companies to play in facilitating this transition. And I think that, these companies, as you said, have so much sway over the food system, not just in America, but globally. I mean, these are some of the biggest companies in the world. Cargill is, I believe, the largest privately held company in the world. Tyson Foods is massive. And so I think that if you can get some of these big players interested and on board, it's just a much faster way to scale that impact. And so I think working with the industry, finding common ground wherever possible, is absolutely critical. And I think that can't be underestimated. So I'm very supportive of those efforts.
What do you view are kind of the biggest challenges currently with the transition itself for big companies? They, of course, receive a lot of funding from the U.S. government to support the whole, as you mentioned, farmer agricultural industry. A lot of it then feeds into feeding the animals that produces the meats. How does that impact a lot of the jobs and opportunities that are currently in existence if this industry transitions to growing the meats themselves, perhaps in massive, factories or industrial labs that can produce the amount of meat at scale?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot there, but I think just starting on the jobs piece, I think one, we're looking at massive increases in demand for meat. And so the notion that these industries are going to displace anything overnight, I think is unrealistic. I think what you're going to see is a more gradual transition over the course of not just years but decades. And I don't think you're going to see massive job displacement in the sense of all of a sudden a farmer wakes up and tomorrow they don't have a job. I think it's going to be a gradual process that will allow folks to, find other opportunities, or just gracefully transition out of the industry. And the organization Mercy for Animals that I mentioned earlier is actually doing some really interesting work. They call it transformation, where they basically work with existing livestock farms to transition them to, for instance, peas or legumes or other sorts of beans, other sorts of things that should have value for the alternative protein industry. Two, I think the biggest challenge right now for the industry is actually not pushback from incumbents. It really is in the cultivated meat side specifically. It really is more on the technology side. It is scale and affordability. Those are really the things. And then, of course, all the funding that is needed to accomplish that. Those are things that are still work in progress. And I can say, from my experience on the inside and upside, there has been tremendous progress from when we were founded in 2015 to today. Coming down the cost curve at orders of magnitude. But there is still work to do there. And I think, it's challenging work. I feel very optimistic that the industry will get there. But I also think in this macroeconomic environment, you'll probably have some industry consolidation just because it's harder to raise money these days with interest rates as high as they are. And so the less well-funded companies, I think a lot of them will probably struggle to raise their next round. And I think what you're going to see is consolidation where some of the bigger players in the space, including Upside, are going to be the ones that sort of continue to push forward. All of that said, I think it's a tremendously exciting space. And I think folks should definitely consider working there if they're interested in climate, if they're interested in working at a startup, if they're interested certainly in animal welfare. This is an incredible opportunity that sits at the intersection of all of these different areas.
Yeah. I want to, talk a little bit about the end product and, what the purpose is, which is, as you mentioned, more and more people want to eat meat. There's a growing population as countries around the world further develops, even as the population in the U.S. grows more slowly and population in Europe, especially in the more developed nations, are kind of slowing or reversing in some areas. There are hesitancies with the global consumer, perhaps at some level, with, as we mentioned earlier, kind of like fake meats, vegetable alternatives to meat. How do you think, the markets, the customers will react to kind of this cultivated meat entering the marketplace?
Yeah, it's a great question. So there is a wealth of survey data now suggesting that anywhere from 1/3 to 2/3 of Americans would eat cultivated meat, and that a large chunk of those are already ready to eat it on a regular basis. And so I think as an early adopters segment, that is very promising. And I think the nature of just the technological challenges that remain, the industry will be supply constrained for quite a while as opposed to demand constrained. I think there will be plenty of consumer demand out there. I think that there's also some really interesting signs. I think we're going to see a few things moving forward, just kind of global trends. One is increasing interest in technologies that can help solve the climate crisis, which obviously this is one of those. But two, I think there's a real shifting attitude that is happening very quietly and sort of under the surface about animals. And there's a great example of this where, depending on how you word the survey, anywhere from 1/3 to 1/2 of Americans would be in favor of a policy banning slaughterhouses in the U.S., which, if you think about it, has very radical implications for just how food is produced in America. But I think speaks to the growing consensus that animals have been sort of unfairly pushed to the side in recent conversations and in society. In this, I should say, this is research that was done by a university very closely affiliated with the agribusiness industry. So this is not research out of an activist group on the animal side. And so I think all of these trends are sort of going in the right direction, and I think we will see, from that very solid starting point of 1 to 2/3 of Americans that are excited for these products, we'll only see that grow over time. I should mention there's also pulling outside the U.S., and it finds generally pretty similar things. Now, it's not always for the same reasons. In certain places, it's more about food safety or food security versus climate or animal welfare or whatever. But there's so many different reasons to want this technology to succeed that I think, regardless of where you are in the world, there will be a reason to get excited for it.
Well, to get at first, as you mentioned, right, we need the companies that are breaking ground in this new nascent industry. We need the customers who are willing, but a third, but if not as important stakeholder, of course, is the government. And you've mentioned the USDA, of course. You've mentioned the FDA. Can you talk a little bit about how important those two, organizations, those two government institutions are to kind of even allowing this, industry to exist?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think FDA and USDA played an absolutely critical role and are continuing to play that. And that is to put the companies through tremendous amounts of scrutiny to make sure that the products are, one, properly labeled, and two, obviously safe for consumption. Because that is, at the end of the day, the role of these government institutions and these government agencies is to make sure of those two things. In addition to other stuff, but I'd say those are probably the most important ones. And so the way they did that in the case of FDA doing the pre-market safety assessment for cultivated meat is they paged through hundreds of pages of data on the safety profile of these products. They came back with clarification questions, with requests to do X, Y, Z, and it was a multi-year process to get through that. And I think that's what you want. I mean, I think in a world where the government is regulating food safety, which is most countries in the world, you really want them to be rigorous and scrutinize every last detail, because you want ultimately a safe food supply, and you want a food supply that folks can trust. And I think the agencies have done exactly that in the U.S. The other country that has been a leader on this front is Singapore. They were actually the first country to approve the sale of cultivated meat back in 2019, I believe. And they, I was mentioning different regions are interested in this technology for different reasons. In the case of Singapore, there's so little arable land, right, that they're importing a lot of their food. And from a food security perspective, in today's geopolitical environment, that's not always the safest way to have a food supply. And so they're very interested in, we're a very small place with very little arable land, but could we still produce meat anyways? And so I think they've really been leaders. And then there's been a handful of governments, including Singapore and the U.S., but also others that have been distributing public funds for the R&D of these products. Israel, India, Japan, the Netherlands, many others. And so I think we're going to continue to see that sort of investment from countries from every corner of the globe.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I think, government will certainly play a big role in allowing this to both be accepted, but also, enter the marketplace to a sufficient level to make a substantial change, whether that's solving food scarcity, quality of food, as well as, of course, as you mentioned, for reducing the impact of providing meat in a more sustainable manner in the 21st century. Well, I think we learned a lot from you today, David, about both your background, your experience, and kind of tackling a little bit more about this space. I would like to just thank you for joining me on this podcast and sharing a bit of your insights and experiences.
Of course, thank you, Will. It was really fun having this conversation, so thanks for inviting me.
Perfect.
Well,
perfect.